Good morning and welcome everyone to part 4 of our MDS 3.0 updates and long-term care changes training. I'm really glad you could join me for this final training of this year. For any newbies to these trainings, I'm Carol Eastburg, the REI, MDS, and OASIS Education Coordinator for the state of Nevada. I've been in this position for 10 years now. And prior to this, I was on the survey team and I participated in on-site state licensure and federal recertification surveys and complaint investigations for multiple different facility types. In the email that I just sent a few minutes ago, you should have received the slides and also a request that you open the link to the user manual. That's really handy to have because I will be referring to some information in there, and obviously it's way too much for me to put on my slides. So you'll want to keep a copy of the most recent manual handy anyway on your desktop to refer to as the need comes up. So our training today is scheduled for 2 hours only. After today's session, you all will be familiar with changes to the item sets, understand how to properly code the items addressed, and be equipped with resources and know where to find information you need while on the job and between trainings. The information in this presentation was current when assembled, and as you know, CMS frequently makes changes, so the information presented here may also change. As a reminder, CMS has several videos that they've posted on their YouTube channel. You can watch them anytime. Please check out the CMS YouTube channel regularly for new training videos that they may post. And also, you can go to our DPBH YouTube channel for training videos that we post, the ones that I post, as well as any others posted by staff. And there's a link to that, the DPBH YouTube channel at the back of your handout in the resources section. So during our last session, I pointed out that it is acceptable to have different staff members enter data into the REI once they're thoroughly trained and can demonstrate competency. For example, the business office or admissions office may fill in the residents' demographics in Section A. And we talked about the fact that LPNs may complete sections of the REI once they have received the appropriate training and demonstrated competency to do so. Because of the frequent changes that are regularly made to the REI, trainings and competency evaluations should be done as needed. And we emphasize the requirement for the RN coordinator to make the assignment and document that each time. And it would be up to the facilities to determine policies and procedures, exactly how and where this will be documented and tracked. And of course, you need to keep a copy of this information in the personnel file. And I also reminded everyone that it is within the purview of state regulatory staff and review teams from the Medicaid division to request these records, including your policies and procedures. Next, we discussed items in sections J, K, M, and N that would be removed, along with their replacements, if any, and that was effective October 1 of this year. We also reviewed and clarified some information from the July training based on questions that were submitted after that session. First, we reviewed what must be documented in the record in order to be able to code a UTI as active upon admission and or in situations where a resident might be sent out for a workup that would be related to a change in condition and where a UA is routinely collected. Second, we clarified the very specific documentation required to code an active diagnosis of schizophrenia. And we talked about the state operations Operations Manual and CMS's prohibition of giving antipsychotic meds to residents with certain undesirable behaviors, which is considered a chemical restraint when the resident has no documented psychotic diagnosis. And that's where the red flag comes in, where if you see a medication that is normally given for some kind of psychotic diagnosis, you need to make sure that you have all the criteria and documentation required to code that as active. And you can get more information in the State Operations Manual or SOM at tag F605. Even though this question was answered live, someone asked it on a post-evaluation question as well. And that is, can therapists complete the BIMS and the PHQ-2 and the PHQ-9 interviews? So I just want to clarify. RAI manual states it is up to the facility to determine who will participate in the assessment process and how that process will be completed while maintaining compliance with the federal regulations. Regarding the BIMS and the PHQ-2 and 9 interviews assessments, if the PT, OT, and SLP have the appropriate training and competency documentation, they may carry out these interviews and assessments. Remember, each facility will need to create and follow their own individual policies and procedures for this important section. The next question that I got on the follow-up was about coding morbid obesity if a resident has other comorbidities along with a BMI greater than 35, but with no provider's written diagnosis. According to the manual, in order to code as an active diagnosis, the record must include documentation, which is signed by a physician or an allowed provider, that includes evidence of active treatments, a physician's medication order for the condition, lab results documented as confirmation of the diagnosis being active, or ongoing monitoring of complications of the disease process during the look-back period. Page I-11 of the manual goes into great detail about where to find specific documentation indicating that a diagnosis is active. You may need to look in the hospital's discharge summary or their history and physical, transfer or progress notes, or the admission H&P for just a couple of ideas of where to look. Or you may get lucky and work with a physician who specifically indicates that a condition is active. The manual goes on to explain several indicators as seen on this slide that may be used to confirm an active diagnosis, including but not limited to a positive study, test, or procedure results, acute care admission for exacerbation of symptoms, a change in therapy within the last 7 days. Examples include, but are not limited to, a new diagnosis of pneumonia or pulmonary embolism as indicated by chest X-ray or other diagnostic procedure, surgery for a fractured hip, blood transfusion for a hematocrit of 24. Please refer to page I-12 of the manual, which is a continuation of this slide, for additional ways to determine if a diagnosis is active or not. If these options fail, you can deploy what is known as a physician query. For information on the physician query, see the link in the resource section in the back of your handouts. Okay. The last time we ended with section N, so today we'll pick it up at section O, special treatments and procedures. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, since we're already 2 months into this new item sets, there were some major changes made in this section. And here we see the instructions for section O with the old version on top and the new version on the bottom. So previously, there were 2 points in time in which to indicate if the treatments, procedures, or programs listed were received by, performed on, or participated in by the resident during the specific time frame. In this case, the last 14 days, either one while not a resident or two while a resident in your facility. Now we see there are 3 points in time in which to indicate if a special treatment, procedure, or program was performed. A, on admission, that is during the first 3 days of a Medicare Part A stay. B, while a resident. And C, at discharge. The instructions to, quote, indicate all that apply, close quote, remain the same as before. And I just want to point out here that the screenshots I'm showing are from a PDF that includes all items available for all assessments. So I'm fairly confident that your software programs only present what would be applicable on any given assessment. And since I don't have access to those same programs, I use the downloaded PDF version that CMS provides. Excuse me. So if you're completing an admission item set, only items or choices for an admission would be present. The columns for while a resident and at discharge would be absent or not accessible. And if you're completing a quarterly or other follow-up item set, only items for that assessment type would be available. The first item in section O relates to chemotherapy and radiation treatments. Previously, you had 2 choices, either chemo or radiation, both while not a resident and while a resident. Now, there are 5 choices, but only A1 chemo and B1 radiation can be coded on admission while a resident and at discharge. And of course, they're all renumbered. The manual cautions you to ensure a medication is truly being used as an anti-neoplastic drug if you're going to code it in this section. For example, the medication Megace or megestrol acetate is an anti-neoplastic drug that has been shown to have the side effect of appetite increase. If the resident is receiving Megace as an appetite stimulant for weight gain, you would not code it here as oral chemotherapy. Likewise, hormonal and other agents given to prevent the recurrence or slow the growth of cancer should not be coded here, as they are not considered chemotherapy for the purpose of coding the MDS. And by the way, chemo administered via a feeding or PEG tube would be coded as A3 oral. And you can see information on that in the manual, page 04, O-4. The manual also points out that IVs, IV medications, and blood transfusions administered in conjunction with chemotherapy are not recorded under items K0520A, parenteral IV, O0110H, IV medications, or 0110I, transfusions. Those are recorded elsewhere. As this example from page O-4 in the manual explains, tamoxifen, a selective estrogen receptor modulator given after the resident completed her chemo and radiation treatments, would not be coded as chemotherapy because it is a hormone and is being used to slow the growth of any remaining cancer cells and decrease the risk of the cancer recurring. So again, remember, when you see a medication that is typically given for the treatment of cancer, make sure to review the medical record to determine how the drug is being used in each individual case. When it comes to respiratory treatments, there are also many changes. Previously, there were 5 options from which to choose. Now there are 12. Oxygen therapy, which was previously coded simply as oxygen therapy, has been divided into 3 types: continuous, intermittent, and high concentration. Continuous is defined as 14 hours or more per day. Intermittent would be less than 14 hours per day. A high concentration therapy system delivers oxygen at a concentration that exceeds a fraction of inspired oxygen of 40%. That is, it exceeds that of simple low flow nasal cannula at a flow rate of 4 liters per minute. This same delivery system can include either high or low flow systems, for example, a simple mask or face mask, partial and non-rebreather masks, face tents, Venturi masks, aerosol masks, and high flow cannula or masks. Excuse me. And they may also include invasive mechanical ventilators, non-invasive mechanical ventilators, or trach masks if the delivered FiO2 of these systems exceeds 40%. Oxygen conserving nasal cannula systems with reservoirs, for example, a mustache or a pendant, should be included only if they are used to deliver an FiO of greater than 40%. Suctioning has been separated into scheduled or as needed and should be coded only for tracheal and or nasopharyngeal, not oral suctioning. Note that this item may be coded if the resident performs it on themselves. Tracheostomy care has not changed. This should be coded when tracheostomy, cannula, or laryngectomy tube care was performed either by the staff or the resident. Invasive mechanical ventilator or respirator is unchanged and should be coded if a resident is unable to support their own respiration and the process is controlled by the machine. Note that you would also code this if a resident is in the process of being weaned off or was weaned off of a respirator or ventilator in the last 14 days or during the 14-day look-back period. Do not code this item when a ventilator or respirator is used only as a substitute for BiPAP or CPAP. And last, we see that non-invasive mechanical ventilator has been revised so that BiPAP and CPAP are listed separately. And you can note also that this item may be coded if the resident is independent in donning and doffing the BiPAP or CPAP mask or device. Example of a resident on invasive mechanical ventilation 24 hours a day due to the inability to breathe independently. This example from page 0-5 in the manual does not indicate the type of assessment being completed. It does state that this item, 00110 F1, would be coded with the check in the column B while a resident. As seen on the previous slide, the ability to code on admission while a resident and at discharge are all options. So depending on the type of assessment being completed, you would check all that apply. Next, we have the section labeled Other, where we find IV medications as before, except now they're categorized as H2 vasoactive, H3 antibiotics, H4 anticoagulant, and H10 other. The category of other should be checked if the resident received any IV medication not covered in the previous categories during the first 3 or the last 3 days of the stay. Transfusions of blood or any blood products, such as platelets or synthetic blood products that are administered directly into the bloodstream, should be coded here. Transfusions and or IV medications given during either chemotherapy or dialysis are not coded here, as those are considered part of those therapies. Code any drug or biological given by intravenous push, epidural pump, or drip through a central or peripheral port in this item. Do not code flushes to keep an IV access port patent or IV fluids without medication in this area. Epidural, intrathecal, and baclofen pumps may be coded here as they are like IV medications in that they must be monitored frequently and involve a continuous administration of a substance. Lactated ringers given IV is not considered a medication and should not be coded here. Links to resources and tools providing information on medications are available on page N-11 of the manual. As you can see, J1 dialysis is now broken down into J2 hemodialysis and J3 peritoneal dialysis. Code peritoneal or renal dialysis, whether it occurs at the nursing home or at another facility. Record treatments of hemofiltration, slow continuous ultrafiltration or SCUF, continuous arterial venous hemofiltration, or CAVH, and continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis, CAPD, in this item. Remember that IVs, IV medication, and blood transfusions administered during dialysis are considered part of the dialysis procedure and are not to be coded under items K0520A, parenteral IV, O0110H, IV medications, or O0110I transfusions. And this item may be coded if the resident performs their own dialysis. All right, at O1, IV access now appears here with 3 specific access options. You now have O2 peripheral, O3 midline, and O4 central, which would include a peripherally inserted central catheter, or PIC, or a tunneled catheter or an implanted port. And of course, there is Z1 if they have none of the above. Only the numbering, identification of the items changed for hospice care and isolation. The requirements to code them did not change. Consider this a friendly reminder regarding the requirements to code single room isolation. Section P, which covers physical restraints and alarms, was not modified in any way. But there is a lot of information related to restraints, so I'd like to take a moment or two to highlight a few points. Per CMS, the manual defines a physical restraint as any manual method or physical or mechanical device, material, or equipment attached or adjacent to the resident's body that the resident cannot remove easily, which restricts freedom of movement or normal access to one's body. And this is also stated in the SOM Appendix PP. Note that CMS does not prohibit the use of physical restraints the way they do chemical restraints. However, they are committed to reducing the unnecessary use of physical restraints in nursing facilities. All other possible alternatives should be considered first, and the least restrictive option should be used to begin with. A restraint, if used, must be for the resident's benefit and not for resident discipline or staff convenience. Care planning must include steps to prevent adverse effects that can occur, especially with cognitively impaired individuals, and if possible, there should be a goal and a plan to reduce and or eliminate the restraint. If the IDT determines that a resident needs a physical restraint and all criteria are met, be sure the record has thorough physician documentation of the medical symptom that supports the use of the restraint. You also need a signed physician's order that includes the type of restraint and the parameters for use, such as when to apply it, the frequency with which staff should monitor the resident at a minimum. The care plan should include frequent monitoring of the resident and actions to take for any untoward effects the resident may have due to the restraint use. All details must be documented thoroughly with dates, time, resident's response, and all related pertinent details. While a restraint-free environment is not a federal requirement, CMS stresses that their use should be the exception and not the rule. Let's talk about bed rails. There are different designs, but all pose a risk, especially for your cognitively impaired individuals. Remember, according to the SOM, if the item cannot be easily removed by the resident, it is classified as a restraint. Would you say that a full bed rail can be easily removed or lowered by the resident so he or she can get out of bed? Unless they've changed the design and put the release button where the occupant of the bed can reach and release it, I would say no. Partial bed rails may be used to assist the resident to get out of bed independently, and so-called portable ones are designed specifically to assist one in and out of bed as well as positioning. Unfortunately, all three types present certain risks. The U.S. Federal Drug Administration, or the FDA, has identified what they call the 7 zones of entrapment. Bed rails may have the effect of restraining one individual, but not another, depending on the individual resident's conditions and circumstances. What about the resident who is determined to get out of bed even though there are bed rails in place? Now you're at risk of the resident trying to climb over the rail or the end of the bed and falling and causing a serious injury. Facilities must use a person-centered approach when determining the use of bed rails, which would include conducting, at a minimum, a comprehensive assessment and identifying the medical symptom being treated by using bed rails. This slide is just to illustrate the 7 zones and point out that even partial rails have unsafe zones. As you can see, zone 1, if you just had a partial rail that was at near the head of the bed, zone 1 is a zone, unsafe zone. People could get, I don't know how they could get their head in there, but they could get their head where you see zone 3 between the rail and the mattress. Everywhere you see a zone, that's where they could get entangled or trapped, resulting in either an injury and or asphyxiation. Okay, and then page P7 in the manual points out the difference regarding the use of geri-chairs and residents who can transfer independently versus those who are immobile. Note that the decision about how to code any manual method or physical or mechanical device, material, equipment as a restraint depends on the effect it has on that individual resident. If the resident can easily remove or get out of whatever it is, it would not be considered a restraint. In this illustration of the wheelchair with the lap belt, the buckle to release the belt is behind the person sitting in the chair. Would this be considered a restraint? Of course it would be. Even with the release positioned in the front, if a cognitively impaired resident could not remember how to trigger the release button, it would be considered a restraint for that resident. Other methods of restraints include cushions, jackets, limb or hand mitts, trunk, vests, and wrist restraints. Also, tucking the sheets in so tightly that the resident cannot move in bed would be considered a restraint. And a person may need to physically hold a part of a resident in a way that restricts the resident's movement, such as if they're being combative and you hold their hand down so they can't strike you, that would be considered a restraint as well. In this illustration with the geri-chair with the lap tray on it, if the resident was not able to release that lap tray and stand up on their own, it would be considered a restraint. Likewise, if you have a mobile person and you put them in a geri-chair and then recline it back, and they're unable to get out of that chair, that would be considered a restraint for that person. Page P7 points out the difference regarding the use of geri-chairs and residents who can transfer independently versus those who are immobile. Regarding both items, bed rails and geri-chairs, what may be considered a restraint for one resident may not necessarily be a restraint for another resident. A cognitively impaired resident who frequently stood up independently, wandered the hallways, and went in and out of other residents' rooms, upsetting those residents. A staff member had the resident sit in a geri-chair and then reclined it so the resident could not stand independently, and parked it by the nurse's station so the resident could interact with people going by. This would be considered a restraint since the resident was unable to independently stand up from the geri-chair while in the declined position. And you would check G, chair prevents rising. Please see the comprehensive explanation regarding all details related to physical restraints beginning on page P-1 of the manual. As mentioned, no changes were made to the coding of alarms, and this slide shows the options you have if an alarm is used. The manual defines an alarm as any physical or electronic device that monitors resident movement and alerts the staff by either audible or inaudible means when movement is detected, and may include bed, chair, and floor sensor pads, cords that clip to the resident's clothing, motion sensors, door alarms, or elopement/wandering notification devices. And yet, audible alarms tend to be loud and obnoxious. A loud sound can startle even residents without cognition issues and cause them to stumble and fall. These loud sounds can also cause fear, anxiety, and agitation by cognitively impaired residents who may stop moving to avoid the sound. When this happens and the resident becomes immobile, the alarm could be coded as a restraint. Remember, it's the effect that it has on that particular resident. Additional adverse consequences of audible alarm use include, but are not limited to, sleep disturbances, infringement on dignity, privacy, and disruption of a quiet environment for everyone. Also, frequently activated audible alarms may cause staff to develop alarm fatigue and fail to respond in a timely manner, which gives the resident plenty of time to fall or otherwise, quote, get into trouble, close quote. Inaudible alarms, on the other hand, do cut down on the ambient noise when they ring or cause a light to go on at the nursing station, which usually those have a volume control, and I've seen them be turned down so that nothing can be heard. But if no one happens to be at the nursing station at the time, the alarm goes unanswered. And again, the resident may experience injury. Also, they may be ignored. So, while often used as an intervention in a resident's fall prevention plan, alarms have not been proven to prevent falls. And in the case of floor mat alarms, these go off when the resident has fallen out of bed onto the mat. So that's fall detection, not prevention. For these reasons, alarm use must not be the primary or sole intervention in any fall prevention plan. Additional alarm information is located on pages P-9 through P-11 of the manual. Okay, in this new version, item Q0100 has been replaced with Q0110. As you can see, there are 6 options, including Z, none of the above. The instructions are to identify all who actively participated in the assessment process by putting a check in the box next to each appropriate option. If no one, including the resident, participated in the assessment and goal-setting activity, check Z, none of the above. As you can see here, Q0300 has been replaced by Q03. So as you can see here, if the resident's overall goal, if the resident participated in determining if they want to be discharged to the community, remain in the facility, discharged to another facility or institution, or if they don't know or they're uncertain, then you would indicate what that choice is. In 0310B, you're going to indicate the information source for Q0310A. So did the resident give that information? Did the family provide it? Was it a significant other, a spouse or partner? Was it the resident's legal guardian, or was it another legally authorized representative? And you have 9 for none of the above. So today we reviewed exactly who can participate in the completion of the RAI. Hopefully there won't be any more questions after today. We also reinforced the need to have the physician's written diagnosis in order to be able to code one as active. And we learned that if you don't have that necessary documentation, you should initiate and send a query to the provider. We went over the changed and updated items in Section O, Special Treatments, Procedures, and Programs. And even though no changes were made to Section P, Restraints and Alarms, we went over some important information related to those items. And like I mentioned at our last training, I know you don't have time to go through and read the whole 1,710 pages of this new manual, but if you read at the minimum the red portions, those are all the revised portions, you can catch up on the details of the most recent changes. So are there any questions? If you have a question, raise your hand. Hi, Kira, you should be able to unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself on your end? Okay, I see in the chat you said no question. Huh. No questions, anybody? Did you hear that? Okay. I'm going to send you the post-test. Please read the directions and we will get back together and go over the answers. So today we reviewed exactly who can participate in the completion of the RAI. Hopefully there won't be any more questions after today. We also reinforced the need to have the physician's written diagnosis in order to be able to code one as active. And we learned that if you don't have that necessary documentation, you should initiate and send a query to the provider. We went over the changed and updated items in Section O, special treatments, procedures, and programs. And even though no changes were made to Section P, restraints and alarms, we went over some important information related to those items. And like I mentioned at our last training, I know you don't have time to go through and read the whole 1,710 pages of this new manual, but if you read at the minimum the red portions, those are all the revised portions, you can catch up on the details of the most recent changes. So are there any questions? If you have a question, raise your hand. Hi, Kira, you should be able to unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself on your end? Okay, I see in the chat you said no question. Huh. No questions, anybody? Did you hear that? Okay. I'm going to send you the post-test. Please read the directions and we will get back together and go over the answers.